The unforgettable interview, a moment that changed everything. The studio lights blazed with unrelenting heat, their harsh glare casting sharp shadows across the faces of everyone in the room. Cameras lined the edges of the set, their mechanical whirs and clicks punctuating the heavy silence that seemed to hover before the storm was about to break. Alan Diarra, a journalist renowned and feared for his razor-sharp tongue and aggressive interview style, sat poised behind his desk. His eyes gleamed with a mixture of anticipation and arrogance as he prepared to corner his latest guest. Opposite him, sitting with unshaken calm and an air of quiet authority, was Ibrahim Traoré, the transitional leader of Burkina Faso. His simple military uniform set him apart from the polished politicians and polished talk show guests who usually graced this studio. There were no entourages, no security personnel filling the seats nearby, just one man, steady and composed. Despite the years of conflict and turmoil his country had endured, Ibrahim's presence exuded a silent strength that immediately demanded respect. The interview began with the kind of bluntness that could feel like an ambush. Alan wasted no time. Mr. Traoré, he began, his voice cold and sharp. How does a man with no formal political background think he can lead a country torn apart by terrorism and grinding poverty? You have no political pedigree, no elite connections. What makes you think you're the right person for this job? The room fell into a thick silence. Producers behind the scenes exchanged wary glances, aware that the question was as much a challenge as an accusation. Alan's lips curled into a smirk as he leaned forward, sensing the tension building. Some whispered among themselves. An assistant's hand trembled as she gripped her clipboard. Another quietly muted her microphone, fearing the answer might crack the delicate veneer of control. Yet Ibrahim Traoré sat unmoved, his gaze steady and direct. For a moment, he simply looked Alan in the eye, not with anger, not with defiance, but with a calmness that carried an unspoken weight. Then, slowly and deliberately, he spoke. Do you ask those who bleed for their people to prove their worth? Or do you stand with them and ask what you can give? The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The studio was suddenly wrapped in stunned silence. The kind of silence that only comes when a statement cuts through the noise and challenges everything that's been taken for granted. As the cameras zoomed in on his face, capturing every subtle shift in expression, far away in a modest home in a dusty neighborhood, a boy named Karim sat cross-legged on the floor. His shirt was several sizes too big, the collar frayed and torn from wear. Beside him, his grandmother coughed weakly, her health fragile after months of illness. The television flickered with a patchy signal, yet Karim's eyes remained locked on the screen. He didn't understand politics. He didn't know the man in the uniform, or the intricacies of national leadership. But something about Ibrahim's voice, steady, kind, and real, felt familiar. It was the voice of someone who had walked through hardship, someone who understood pain and sacrifice. Back in the studio, Alan pressed forward, undeterred. You speak of sacrifice, Mr. President, he said. But are you willing to admit that your government has failed in areas where others warned you? That perhaps you aren't the savior some hoped for? Karim clenched his small fists tightly. Let him talk, he whispered to himself, a spark of quiet hope kindling inside him. Ibrahim's response was measured, his smile gentle but resolute. I didn't come here to prove perfection, he said. I came to serve, even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts. Karim blinked, struck by a revelation he hadn't expected from a leader. Honesty, humility, a willingness to shoulder the burdens without pretending they don't exist. In the control room above the studio, Lucy, the producer who had arranged the interview hoping for a sensational confrontation, felt her hands begin to tremble. She had expected drama, confrontation, maybe even embarrassment for Traoré. What she wasn't prepared for was dignity, calm strength that was disarming. Suddenly, a call crackled through her earpiece. It was the Prime Minister's office. Do not cut the feed, the voice commanded firmly. Let the people hear him. Let the truth speak. Oh, back on stage, Alan fired one last, hard-hitting question, trying to regain control. Mr. President, why should we believe that you, an ordinary man with no political dynasty or elite background, can lead this country? Ibrahim's eyes softened as he answered, his voice steady and powerful like a river carving its way through rocky terrain. Because I was that boy, he said, the one who sold mangoes to pay school fees. Because I still walk where others drive, because power to me is not a crown, It is a burden, and I carry it for them." Lucy wiped tears from her eyes, overwhelmed by the weight of the moment. Something historic was unfolding before her eyes. In the shadows behind the curtain, Adama, a junior intern on his first week at the station, stood rooted to the spot. Instead of refilling water for the guests as he was supposed to, he found himself unable to look away from the screen, caught in the gravity of Ibrahim Traoré's words. This was not just an interview. It was a powerful, defining moment, a glimpse of leadership forged not from privilege or power, but from pain, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment. The quiet strength of a man who carries burdens. Adama had never seen the president this close before, not like this. Without an imposing entourage of armed guards flanking the room, without the usual barrage of loud speeches or rehearsed statements meant to dazzle or intimidate. No, this was something different. This was a man who sat simply, stripped of ceremony and pomp, answering questions quietly, calmly. There was no need to shout when every word was weighted with meaning. To Adama, the calm kindness in President Ibrahim Traoré's voice was surprising, almost disarming. It was the voice of a man who had known pain intimately, who had walked the same dusty, sun-baked roads of hardship that many in Burkina Faso knew too well. And it was in this quiet strength that Adama found himself pulled in. He thought of his own father, a soldier who had given his life fighting terrorists near the northern borders just a year ago. The memory still burned fresh, raw and jagged. Since then, Adama had nurtured a deep-seated resentment toward anything military. To him, the uniform was a symbol of loss and fear, of absence at the family table. Yet, as he listened to Ibrahim speak of carrying burdens for the people, something inside him cracked open. This wasn't a man chasing power or political games. This was a man standing alone, carrying the hopes and pains of millions on his shoulders. On the stage, Alan Daira, the journalist with a smirk that could chill a room, was relentless. "I see your medals," Alan sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "But do medals feed our people?" The audience waited for Traoré to react with indignation or anger. But there was none. Ibrahim's face remained serene, his eyes steady. He responded softly with a voice that seemed to cradle every word. "No," he said, "medals do not feed our people. But the sacrifices behind them protect those who do the feeding." For the first time since his father's funeral, Adama gasped. The sharp, painful grief that had haunted him softened, replaced by a tentative smile. Quietly, as if sharing a secret with himself, he whispered, "Papa would have followed this man." Far away, in the small living room of a humble home on the outskirts of Babdulasso, Karim's silent tears fell. He was not sobbing, his tears were the quiet, profound kind. The kind that come when a boy suddenly understands something too vast for his young heart to contain. His grandmother, weakened by illness, had dozed off beside him, her breath shallow and uneven. On the screen, the man who looked like a warrior, yet spoke with the gentle voice of a teacher, was still answering questions, still holding the room in awe. Alan's voice suddenly rose, sharp and aggressive. "What makes you think you know what's best for this country?" Traoré paused, gathering himself. Then, his words fell like steady rain, deliberate and honest. "Because I have slept in the rain. I have taught children with no shoes. I have buried friends without coffins. I know pain, I know hunger, and I have seen hope in the darkest places." Karim's chest tightened with memories. The shame of being chased out of school because his fees were unpaid. The nights spent crying quietly into his grandmother's arms. And now, this man, this president, was speaking for boys like him, for families like his. He grabbed his school notebook and began to sketch the face he saw on the screen. Beneath the rough pencil lines, one word emerged: happy. Meanwhile, high above in the control booth, Lucy stared in disbelief at the rapidly climbing viewer count scrolling across her screen. 400,000, 530,000, 780,000. The numbers exploded with breathtaking speed. She had booked this interview expecting a scandal, a misstep, a public humiliation that would shake Traoré's credibility. Instead, the world was watching a masterclass in humility and leadership. The raw truth of a man who carried the weight of his nation on his shoulders and yet spoke with profound grace. Back on the set, Alan's agitation grew. His questions became sharper, desperate to regain control. "But isn't it true," he barked, "that some say your leadership is just a military stunt?" Traoré smiled gently, his voice calm but firm. "There are people who use uniforms to control, and there are people who wear them to protect. I chose the second." The audience in the studio erupted in applause. It was the first genuine applause of the night. Alan froze. This wasn't in the script. Lucy's assistant leaned close, whispering nervously, "Should we cut the feed?" Lucy said nothing. She couldn't. Tears quietly rolled down her cheeks. Her father had once whispered a goodbye to her over the phone from a battlefield, before his final mission. She had buried that memory deep for years, but now this man on TV was bringing it back, not with words but with truth. And that truth was shattering everything she thought she knew. The cameras rolled on. A silence filled the studio, one that was not the uncomfortable, forced silence that is often broken by nervous laughter. No, this was a silence heavy with meaning, like a heartbeat holding its breath. Alan had just asked the cruelest question yet. Do you ever feel guilty sitting in power while mothers bury their sons? Even the crew flinched. But Traore did not answer with anger or defensiveness. Instead, he looked up, his voice soft and cracked with emotion. "Every single night," he said. He swallowed hard, then continued, "I write their names in my journal. I meet their families. I walk their villages. Power doesn't protect me from pain. It forces me to carry it." There was no applause, no cheering. Just the weight of truth settling over everyone watching. Alan looked down at his papers, suddenly unsure what to say next. Backstage, Adama wiped his face again, realizing his hands were wet, not from sweat but tears. The boy who had once resented soldiers now saw them differently. Because for the first time, he saw a soldier who carried his pain. Not as a weapon or symbol of loss, but as a mantle of responsibility and love. It felt like someone up there actually cared. That's what Adama thought as he sat transfixed before the flickering screen in his small home, the dim light casting long shadows on the walls. The voice coming from the television wasn't the usual bluster or polished political speech. No grandiose promises filled with empty words. Instead, it was calm, clear, honest. A voice carrying the weight of hard truth. "I visited a camp in Kaya," President Ibrahim Traore said, adjusting the collar of his worn jacket with a slight, wary gesture that made him seem human, not untouchable. On the screen, the camera shifted, zooming in slowly, focusing on a small, dark-skinned girl with wide, bright eyes. The air seemed to change, turn colder somehow, as the story unfolded. Her name was Aminata, the president continued softly. She was 7 years old. She had lost her father to a rebel attack, and her mother to illness. She was alone. Yet she smiled. The image lingered on Aminata's face, an expression of fragile hope. A small defiant curve of lips despite the enormous weight of loss pressing on her young shoulders. Alan Diarra, the journalist, lifted an eyebrow. The cynical gleam in his eyes unmistakable. "And what does that have to do with policy?" His voice was sharp, cutting through the room like a knife. Traore looked at him, not with anger, but with sorrow. His gaze seemed to hold the accumulated grief of 1,000 stories like Aminata's. "Everything," he said softly. "She told me once, if I can smile, maybe others will too." That child reminded me that leadership is not about control. It's about healing. The studio fell silent. The kind of silence that presses down, filling every corner. Somewhere in the audience, a woman's shoulders shook gently, a quiet sob breaking free. Her name was Kata. 3 years ago she had lost her son to a roadside bomb. Since then, politics had been a closed book to her, a source of bitterness and pain she could no longer bear. She had stopped watching, stopped hoping. Until now, her heart broke again, but this time it was not from despair. It was relief. Finally, someone who wasn't reading from a script. Finally, someone speaking from the soul. Back in the station's control room, phones rang incessantly. "We have calls from Mali Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana," Lucy's assistant shouted over the rising din. "France is airing clips already," another voice yelled. "Look at this!" No one spoke louder than Traore, yet the world was listening. Alan, now visibly sweating, made one last attempt, voice edged with desperation. "If you truly loved the people," he challenged, "wouldn't you step down and let a civilian lead?" The trap was clear, bitter bait. Traore nodded slowly, eyes steady. "One day, yes," he said, "but not yet. Because the house is on fire, and I am the one holding the hose." He leaned forward, voice dropping with quiet resolve. "When it's safe, I will leave. Not for glory, but so the next leader can plant without fearing flames." The cameraman whispered, "Mir," as Alan slumped back, speechless. Everyone in the studio felt the shift. This wasn't politics anymore. It was personal. Across Burkina Faso, fathers held their sons closer. Mothers reached for tissue boxes. Children whispered a new word on their lips. Respect amid the intensity. A staff member handed Traore a folded note. Mid-interview, he read it silently. His eyes didn't blink as the weight settled on him. Then he looked up, locking gaze with the camera. "Permission to share something?" he asked. Alan nodded uncertainly. "This is a letter." Traore began, voice steady but soft, "From Captain Sidbi. He died yesterday in Djibo. He asked me to read this if anything ever happened to him." The studio fell utterly quiet once more. Mon Pere silent. Traore read aloud, "If I die, please tell my son why I fought not for medals, not for power, but so he can one day play football without hearing gunshots, so he can go to school with both shoes, so he can smile." He folded the letter fully and placed it carefully into his jacket pocket. Captain Sidbi was 31. His wife was watching now, cradling their 3-year-old boy. The camera panned to Alan's pale face. In the control room, Lucy's hands trembled. Across the nation, people were not just watching, they were feeling. Right before the break, Traore surprised everyone. "I'd like to invite someone," he said quietly. Alan looked puzzled. "Excuse me." Traore pointed to the side curtain. Out walked a young woman in her 20s, plain clothes, but she stood tall, proud, unshaken.
"This," Traore said, "is Fatima, a nurse.
She's been working in a conflict zone hospital in Foden Gorma alone." The audience murmured softly. Fatima gave a shy wave. Traore stepped aside as she spoke. "I've stitched wounds with no anesthesia. I've comforted crying children with no family left. But I do it because our people, they matter." Her voice cracked. "Last week, rebels attacked our clinic. I hid 2 babies under a table with my own body. If not for the army arriving, if not for President Traore's efforts, they'd be gone." Alan couldn't speak. The audience sat frozen. Truth had entered the room, and it was wearing a nurse's smile. Outside the studio, hundreds had already gathered, holding candles, watching through windows. It was no longer an interview. What filled the studio was something far bigger, something alive, breathing, and undeniable. A movement. The usual rhythm of the broadcast was shattered. The station planned a commercial break, but President Ibrahim Traore leaned closer to his microphone, his voice dropping to a quiet, intense whisper. "1 minute," he said softly, glancing at the host. The crew scrambled behind the cameras, uncertain but obeying the unspoken command not to cut away. Traore's eyes locked directly onto the lens, his gaze steady and raw. "My father was a farmer," he began, voice low and steady. "And my mother taught me how to read under a mango tree. We had no electricity, but we had love. That's what shaped me. Not titles, not uniforms." He paused, letting the words sink deeply into the room. "I don't pretend to be perfect," he added, voice thick with quiet resolve. "But I promise you, every decision I make, I ask myself, would my mother be proud of this? Would that little boy in Djibo understand it?" For a long moment, there were no spotlights, no cameras pushing their harsh light. There was just raw, heavy silence. The kind of silence that presses into your chest and won't let go. Outside the building, that silence was broken by the rising sound of voices. The crowd began to sing the national anthem softly, their voices tentative at first, then growing stronger. Inside the studio, Fatima pressed her hands over her mouth, trying to hold back the sobs threatening to spill free. Adama, watching from a dusty tea shop hundreds of kilometers away, rose slowly to his feet without realizing it. The cameras kept rolling. No one dared cut away. What had started as an interview, less than 48 hours ago, had transformed into something else entirely. A reckoning, a wake-up call, a mirror held up to a nation wary from violence, lies, and broken promises. The world was not ready for what Ibrahim Traore was becoming. Just as the commercial break seemed inevitable, Traore surprised everyone again. "I received a message yesterday," he said gently, pulling a folded page from his coat. "From a 12-year-old boy in the north." His voice softened as he read slowly, deliberately, letting every word land like a stone in still water. "His name is Yakuba." He cleared his throat and began, "Dear Mr. President, I want to be brave like you. My father died when bandits came. My mother cries at night. I don't want toys. I just want to feel safe. Please don't give up on us." Yakuba. Alan's jaw tensed. He didn't dare speak. Traore's eyes never left the camera. "I hear you, Yakuba," he said firmly. "And I'm not giving up." 600 kilometers away, in a dusty northern village, The boy named Yakuba sat beside his mother, by an old neighbor's radio. She wept quietly as her son listened. Back in the studio, the silence deepened. The viewers across the country were shaking in that moment. This was no longer politics. It was personal. For many, it was the first time they saw a leader not as a distant figure on a podium, but as a father, a brother, a protector. One who listened. Alan finally spoke, his voice noticeably softer than before. "But Mr. President," he said carefully, "isn't this emotional appeal just good theater? Isn't it easier to read letters than to build a country?" The question hung heavy in the room. Traore didn't blink. He stood, moved deliberately to the center of the studio, and sat down on the floor, an unexpected gesture that stunned everyone. Barely anyone breathed. "I've walked barefoot to school," he said quietly. "I've eaten from one bowl with 10 cousins. His eyes locked onto the camera, burning with fierce truth. "My leadership doesn't come from books. It comes from pain." He pointed directly at the lens. "If all you see is a man performing," he said steadily, "then you've missed the point. This isn't about me. This is about what we owe to those who've lost everything." Even Alan lowered his eyes. Traore's voice dropped to a whisper, cutting deep, not just through the room but across the country. "I'm not acting. I'm remembering." That line carved itself into the hearts of veterans watching at home, who saluted quietly in their living rooms. It filled mothers clutching their children tightly. It moved even Alan's own producer, who wiped tears from her eyes. And still, the storm was only growing. That night, no one could sleep. By 9:10 p.m., the streets of Ouagadougou were filled with candles, silent beacons of hope. No one had planned it. It just happened. People came out quietly. Children held hands. Old men carried tattered flags. Women stood with photos of lost loved ones. The entire capital glowed, not with fire, but with hope. A soft chant spread like wind. "Nausim Azunis, Nausim Azunis." Traore watched from the window of his modest home. He turned to his aide and whispered, "Not a word from me. Let the people speak now." In a tiny hospital room, Fatima placed her candle beside a photo of Captain Sid B. Njibo. Yakuba's mother hugged him tighter. At the TV station, Alan sat alone, watching the replay of the interview on a small monitor. He paused the video at Traore's final line. "I'm not acting. I'm remembering." He stared at the screen, and for the first time, he understood what real leadership looked like. But something unexpected was about to happen. Something that would change everything. The air inside the television station was thick with tension. Word had spread like wildfire across the city, across the nation, and even beyond its borders. The journalist who had tried to humiliate President Ibrahim Traoré, the sharp-tongued, fearless Alan Diarra, had vanished from public view for 2 days. Gone was the man once celebrated for his bold questions and biting wit. Now Alan was a man at war with himself. In a small, dimly lit apartment on the outskirts of Ouagadougou, Alan sat unshaven and unsteady. His eyes were bloodshot, glued to the flickering screen of a battered television set. He had watched the replay of the interview for the 100th time. Every line he asked, every smirk he gave, every attempt to corner Traoré in the harsh spotlight. All of it now sounded cruel. His voice had been sharp and mocking. His intent had been to expose, to humiliate. But the man on the screen, calm, steady, unwavering, had responded not with anger or defensiveness, but with truth. Truth that cut through the cynicism like a knife. Alan's hands trembled. He pressed them to his face, trying to hold back a rising tide of shame and regret. He turned slowly away from the screen and walked to the window. Outside, the dusty street was alive with the innocence and resilience of 2 children. They walked barefoot, their feet kicking up little clouds of dirt. One held nothing but a stick, the other a dream, and yet they laughed. Alan's mind traveled back. He remembered a time when he too was like those children, when he had wanted to use his voice not to tear down, but to defend the voiceless, when his sharp questions were weapons wielded in service of truth, not cruelty. The weight of his failure crashed over him like a tidal wave. He collapsed to the floor, sobbing, but then, after the tears had fallen, something inside him shifted. He rose, trembling but resolute. He knew what he had to do. He needed to do something bigger than an apology. Something the world would never forget. The very next morning, Alan requested airtime. The station resisted. They feared the backlash. But when they saw the fire in his eyes, the earnestness burning there, they gave in. He was to step into the same studio, sit in the same chair, face the same camera. Only this time it would be different. That day, Alan did not wear a sharp suit or a practiced smirk. He wore a simple shirt and the humility of a man stripped bare. The red light blinked on. He looked straight into the camera, not with arrogance or defiance, but with trembling honesty. "I failed all of you," he began, voice cracking with sincerity. "I tried to corner a man who has given his life to protecting our people." He swallowed hard. "I used my voice to divide instead of unite." A pause. His eyes glistened with unshaded tears. "But President Traore showed me, and showed the world, what leadership really looks like." He stood firm now, his gaze unwavering. Not for himself, but for every Burkinabe child, mother, and soldier. "That is the man I now admire." A heavy silence fell across the country. Then cheers, then tears, then the door opened. Traore walked in, unexpected, uninvited, but welcome. He placed a steady hand on Alan's shoulder. "This," he said quietly, "is how nations heal." That evening, Traore didn't retreat to a palace or a high-level meeting. He walked through the streets of Ouagadougou with Alan beside him. No cameras, no bodyguards, just two men and the city. At a small village on the outskirts, a group of young boys gathered around him. Barefoot, playing with sticks, their eyes wide with wonder. One boy ran up breathless and asked, "Are you the man on TV?" Traore smiled. "I am," he said, "but more importantly, I'm your servant." The boy tilted his head, curious. "You serve people?" Traore knelt beside him. "Every real leader does." That moment, captured by a single bystander's phone, went viral across Africa. It showed Traore holding the boy's hand and walking him home. That week ended without grand speeches or fireworks. It ended with the quiet memory of humility, redemption, and unity. From that day, Burkina Faso remembered not the argument but the healing. Not the question but the answer. Did this story move you? Did you cry? Did your heart feel something deep? If so, don't leave without showing it. Like this video, spread the message of humility and leadership. Comment, "I believe in hope." If you felt the power of truth and unity, subscribe now for more real-life emotional stories that change lives, and maybe even nations. Let's remind the world sometimes the strongest voice is the one that speaks calmly. And the greatest power is love for your people.